have about an hour or less. I wanted to cover some of the basic HR things you should think about if you're in a business or an organization in Peterborough of another kind. So certainly as we go, I have some material to present, but what I find is if there's areas or issues that you're experiencing in the workplace or that are of particular concern to you, feel free to jump in. This is not a lecture format, even though I'm standing up here at the front with a clicker. Feel free to share your own experiences, own ideas around anything that we have to present or discuss this afternoon. So maybe just before we get started, just a show of hands, how many of you have employees? And just keep your hands up. More than 5? More than 10? More than 20? So a few of you. Yeah, and so I asked that, I did a presentation last month, and it was a group of entrepreneurs, and no one had any employees. So it was kind of interesting that we were talking about HR, but they, being entrepreneurs and really intelligent people, they were thinking in the right direction already. They wanted to know some of this stuff before they embarked upon that next phase in their growth plan. We do human resources consulting in this area and elsewhere in Ontario and out west as well a little bit too. Typical business size for us is about 5 to 50 employees. We do have some much larger employers, but that tends to be where 80% of our focus is. So the reality is the scalability of what I'm going to talk about today is just as relevant if you have 1 employee as if you have 1,000, really. So maybe we'll get started and let's see if I can, yeah. So just some general stats, which you're probably all aware of and experiencing maybe even in your own workplaces. People change jobs a lot more often than they used to, and even career paths versus what used to be the case of previous generations. And I think that this slide is probably even dated. I think I heard a figure the other day that suggested the multiple on this in terms of employee turnover changes even much higher than this. And even the nature of the employment relationship, that orthodox traditional relationship of employee and employer, that's evolving and changing. Younger people, not so young people too, may not rely on one employment relationship, maybe several employment relationships, independent contractor, consulting, all kinds of different things going on. So the workplace is changing. There's a Harvard study said only 16% of employees are engaged at work. Now you could read into the details of that, but that engagement was like a high level of engagement. The 70% that were not engaged, it didn't mean they were disengaged. They just were neither here nor there. And then 14% they said were actively disengaged. So there's a lot of motivation drivers. There's a lot going on in workplaces today. Just last year, the biggest study of its kind that I'm aware of, which occurred over 40 years, 2.5 million employees worldwide. It included Canada and North America. A lot of this is global in its context, but it would be likely, because of so large and people are people, likely very relevant and transferable to Canadian and North American experience. They found that only 10% of us possess the talent to manage others. So whether you're a manager or a business owner, if there's 10 of you, probably there's only 1 in 10 of us have that kind of innate DNA already built in or baked into our interpersonal situation. Companies miss the mark most of the time in identifying people for management positions. We see this so often, engineering groups, the smartest engineer becomes the engineering manager. Well, just because you're the smartest engineer, and that should be valued and appreciated in the organization, doesn't necessarily translate or mean that you have leadership skills. And people who find themselves in those positions sometimes find difficulties with that too. The study also found that, this is no surprise, people who are supervised by engaged managers are more likely to be engaged themselves. The ladies in the room probably already knew this coming in the front door. Female managers, you got a better chance with them than males. Who knows why? The ladies know why. 50% of employees leave jobs to get away from their manager. You know what? We do confidential exit interviews for a number of organizations to get data and stats and feedback on that. I'd say that number's even higher. And if you threw in their manager / a coworker, people don't leave for $1,000 in salary. It's generally, my boss, my coworkers, there's something about the culture or what's going on in the business as opposed to, some compensation drivers are always just that, they're drivers. I'm not saying that they aren't. The point of the matter is, what you do in your workplace and how you do it has relevance to the effectiveness of your business or your organization, and has relevance to the employees that work with you. So we're frequently told the government is there to support and help business, and they do. One of the ways they support your business, if you're a business owner in Ontario, as you already know too well, I suspect, they're very effective at inventing new regulatory and administrative requirements that, for the most part, are well-intended. Accessibility legislation, the AODA, well-intended legislation. If you're a small business owner with a couple of employees, very difficult to navigate and to figure out how to implement. And the challenge now these days is that when I started doing HR stuff about 20 years ago, a lot of this stuff applied to big companies. If you had 20, 50 employees, 100. Now it seems that everything applies to anyone. As soon as you employ one person, you're subject to all this stuff. So when we talk to business owners about this, and we'll go in and we'll do like a workplace, we call it a health check. We don't like to call it an audit because that sounds intimidating. We call it a health check, but it's essentially an 80-point inspection. We do an 80-point inspection because HR is sometimes true colors and how do you feel, and are you a dog, an owl, or a cat? We try to bring it back to a quantitative result. It's an 80-point inspection. We give you a number, we give you a score, and we give you context as to how you relate compared to employers of your size. And what business owners, we hear anyways, they just want to know, what is it that I have to do? I want to do it. I'm not trying to avoid doing it, but I just don't even know what applies to me and what I must do. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. And if you already know this, you know it. But we find that it can be confusing. So we take I call it it's a cornerstone approach. And this is as much a risk management strategy as it is building in best practices into your organization. So when we do this audit, as I'm calling it, it's a health check, we sort of identify, these are the compliance, these are the things that you must do. They're not just nice to do, that you must do. These are best practices that can leverage and move your business forward, we think, based on what we've seen and heard and understand of your business. But we sort of differentiate between those two pools. So we look at your structure. The second part of it is we look at recognition and rewards. What are you doing to motivate and drive performance in your business? The third cornerstone rather is expectation setting standards in the business. And the final one is performance management. Setting appraisals, engaging people. We'll meet with an employer. They've just seen a TED Talk on giving 360-degree feedback. Really a very effective, but still a very sophisticated performance evaluation tool in a workplace. And we'll say, that's great. Do you have job descriptions? No. How about employment agreements? No, we've never done that either. Do you do reference checks? We haven't done that. I want to do 360-degree feedback. You've got to lay in the foundation. You've got to walk before you run. And we will get you running, and we will do the 360 feedback, but we like to make sure you have the fundamentals in place, because what you'll find if you don't put those in place, the top just collapses. All right, so let's get started. Let's talk about organizational structure. Let's test your knowledge. Lindsay, you're not allowed to answer any of these questions. Are job descriptions required? I'm just kidding about that. You can answer them if you want. Please edit that part of the tape, Paul. Are job descriptions required? What do you think, yes or no?
Yes.
Some people are saying yes. Some people are insisting no. How many of you have job descriptions? Maybe we should have started there. Oh, good. Oh, well, I think I'm just going to go and have my lunch then. Not required. Not required. Not legally required. With that said, I don't know how you engage in a systematic, thoughtful approach to recruiting process, to compensation planning, to other things, including 360-degree feedback, if you don't have that fundamental in place already. And sometimes when we see job descriptions, they're there, but they're 20 years old. And the job, the organization, and the structure's probably changed in that 20-year period. So it's one of those things that you want to keep fresh and alive. I would suggest if you have job descriptions, maybe you're doing performance reviews as well, or performance assessments, performance evaluations, development. Pair that with your annual process to review and update that. Okay, so good. Most of you are doing this already. Okay, we got job descriptions. Talent acquisition is a fancy HR word for recruiting. So, you know, one of the things to think about when you're doing recruiting, and I'm not suggesting that, you know, everyone that you recruit meets these characteristics, but people do apply marketing strategies to their resume, and that's normal, that's expected, that's effective. We all do that. Tell me you haven't done that, you've done it too. You do want to be mindful that not all candidates are forthcoming. Not all the information you're evaluating on paper is exactly right. We've done reference checks where these days everyone has cell phones, right? That person, oh yeah, I report to that person. It could be their uncle, their brother, their mom. Not too many moms say bad things about their kids. My mom certainly doesn't. So you just want to be mindful. I'm not suggesting that everyone's misleading, but you want to be mindful of these things when you're looking at recruiting. Some of the best practices that we recommend would be to have that job description, pull it out when you're doing and refresh it before you do your recruiting, but have some kind of posting or pre-screening process in place, right? Behavior-based interviews, we recommend that. Do you know what behavior-based interviews are, questions are? Lindsay, you know.
Yeah.
Tell us what behavior-based, give us an example.
Well, so describe the time, situational, behavioral. It's a question based on, okay, now.
I shouldn't have put you on the spot. No, you're right on. It's situational. I heard you say situational. It's asking you, instead of saying, everyone's got a pattern, everyone asks, what are your 3 biggest strengths and your 3 biggest weaknesses? Well, every candidate, I asked those questions for 10 years. Every candidate has a variation. They give you the same answer pretty much, you know, okay, pretty much. So it's asking a situational question. If a customer comes into the store and it appears kind of agitated, they want to return, they're doing a product return, there's a long lineup, what would you do? Actual real life situation to what you do in your business, not what's your greatest strength and your greatest weakness. Everyone's got a pat answer for that. Skills assessment. If they're hiring a welder, I want to see them weld. Don't tell me how good of a welder you are. Safety concerns aside. Get a bench, get the proper PPE, 2 plates of steel. I want to see the bead on the weld. Okay? If I don't know what that looks like, I'm going to get my shop foreman to tell me what it should look like. Don't just ask me if I'm a good welder. See if that person's a good welder. You're not necessarily going to do this with every person who applies to the job. Build it into your process. References, credit, criminal checks. It's getting a little more difficult to do some of these things. We do recommend that you do reference checks and not just the 3 people that they might recommend. Previous employers, friends and colleagues and peers are relevant and interesting to understand too, but we want previous employers. And we always ask for those, not just the ones that the candidate supplies. If you're hiring an accounts payable clerk or someone who's handling money, do a credit check. Okay, they're not that costly. They can be done pretty quickly and effectively. I don't know why you wouldn't do that. Read in the paper, there's two instances, I think one the police are still investigating here locally, where someone in a job like that, I think one was $10,000 or $20,000, the other was $100,000. And those are ones that get in the paper. We understand and hear about more than that. So some of the things and it's fine to rely on your neighbor. It's fine if you're a hairdresser who's a really good hairdresser and she has a kid who needs a job and she's a great hairdresser and a good person, so the kid must be too, so give them a shot, give them a chance. Okay, but if you're going to do that, and that's fine to use those referral networks, put them through the pyramid. And just make sure, the idea here is have a process, have a structure, and follow it. And I know when you need someone now. And sometimes you need to get a seat in that chair. But resist the temptation to simply get the job filled and make sure you have a robust process, because all the training, development, and investment you're going to make in that person won't correct a bad hire. You've got to start with the right material. You can push, and we're happy to do training and development with employers. We do it all the time. But if you can't spend enough time, and I may be spending more time here than I should, but deliberately so, because this is so critical to the rest of what happens later on. Okay, let's keep going. Let's talk about how you're going to recognize and reward people. Wage grids, salary bands, are those who has, those of you that have job descriptions, do you have wage bands or wage grids, salary bands? Yes? Yes, no? Some people do, some people don't. Are they required, legally required? No?
Pay equity.
I hear Jim say pay equity. Yeah, you know, if you have more than 10 employees, you should have complied with pay equity in 1992, and you should have kept that fresh and updated since then. It's kind of like speeding on the highway. I don't do it, but some of you do. You may not get pulled over, but if you do and you don't have a plan, could have issues. So
What is pay equity?
So pay equity, and we could have a whole module on that, was introduced to ensure wage parity between men and women doing jobs of equal value. Certainly if you're doing the same job, that's no issue, but jobs of equal value. So we got into this as an example. We have a client who has a mining operation, and they're principally men that are mining. It's probably changed a bit now. And then we had a receptionist. So we had to compare the receptionist position to the gentlemen who were blasting and doing all kinds of interesting things. So it's in a nutshell, that's what it is. If you don't have wage bands or salary grids, I don't know how you comply with pay equity. Because you pretty much, they're not saying this is legally required, but without it, you can't comply, I don't think. Employment standards, the only thing it would say, the Employment Standards Act is kind of the minimum standard. You can exceed it. You've got to pay minimum wage. So aside from that, you're paying minimum wage. I think you probably do need to look at something here. If you don't have a pay equity plan, or sometimes we found with a lot of our employers, they have a pay equity plan, they did it in 92 and forgot about it, right? Or they can't find it because computers, everything's on disk and you can archive and do a search and, oh, there it is. Some people just had paper copies, and boy, you know, where is it is it in Iron Mountain? Is it in the warehouse? Where did we put that? So something to be mindful of. They are sending assessment officers out every once in a while. It's like speeding on the highway. You may not get pulled over, but if you do, you want to have something in place. So we have a whole system and a whole program to do that. It's not complex. It's basic, but it's something you want to have in place. And that's the compliance piece. The best practices piece is making sure the recognition and rewards you have for people are aligning performance with what you want to see in your business from an outcome point of view. So there's not a disconnect. So we want rewards to match and merit performance. That's a little more complex. So you're addressing both a compliance and a best practice issue. We could spend 4 hours on any one of these topics. So I'm flying high and fast, but I'm just trying to give you an overview of things you should think about. Okay. We have a lot of different systems that we use to build out. I won't go into this in great detail, but we basically look at these 3 factors for every job, working conditions too. We assign a point value to each and come up with an objective system, and we just keep doing that for every job until we've analyzed every job in your business. But if you don't have job descriptions, we can't do this. Okay? So there's a little bit of meat here. There's quite a bit to this compliance piece, and then there's a whole other layer of best practice in getting your rewards programs in line with where you want to see employee performance. Okay. So job evaluation, you know, that kind of a process, to have a structured salary grid process in place. It just makes sure you're paying fairly internally and with respect to market, that you're attractive, competitive, and there's audit proofing for Pay Equity Commission and other nice people like that may come to visit you. And as with everything, it just ensures a solid foundation for other processes in your business. So you can't get into robust performance management and succession planning and all this great stuff, which you should do, without the basics. You can't. It's awkward and it won't be sustainable. Doesn't have the underpinnings in place that you need. Okay, so we've hired someone finally. It seemed like a long way to get there through all that, but we've hired someone. Are you required to keep employment records? Yes. Do you keep written employment records? That's good. So here are some of the things that we recommend in a new hire checklist. And we have a form and a system for this. The top 3 things, they're kind of 4 things, hopefully they're bold-faced. They are mandatory. So you have to keep certain biographical and personal information. You're likely going to need that to pay them. You've got to keep, how many of you, when you hire a person and put them in your payroll system, if you're responsible for that, get a copy of their social insurance number and photo ID? Yeah, some people do, legally you're supposed to, especially with technology. Someone could supply, most of us, I have my social insurance number memorized. Kids, and I use that colloquially, kids these days don't. There's just too many numbers and passwords. When I was a kid, you had your phone number, your address, and your social insurance number. Now you got a million things that I don't expect people to remember, but you used to have it memorized. Most people people of my vintage will just know that. You technically should ask for their social insurance number and photo identification to verify, so it's not spinning a T4 to someone who's not them. TD1 forms are just tax forms, emergency contact info. Recruitment package results, so resumes, interview notes, got an interview guide, references, certifications, licenses. That's a best practice, not required. We recommend it. Signed offer of employment, which has the job description as an appendix. How many of you are using written offers of employment? Okay. And how many of you are not? Okay.
For just management, not for like just employee.
Okay, so for management, I would use it for any employee. I think it should be in writing. It just defines what our relationship's going to look like from the get-go. And it can also speak to if the relationship is not going well, so the employee knows where they stand and what benefits they have, and the employer has some certainty around that too. Should put it in writing.
But Matthew, how do you, if you already have an existing system in place and you decide you want to implement these types of things, how would you do that? Can you do that for older employees, or do you have to just start with the newer employees? Like getting a signed offer letter is a little bit ridiculous when somebody's worked 25 years in the hotel.
Absolutely, and it's a great question. So if I've been working there 25 years and say, we just talked to this real smart guy, Matthew Savino, and we got this shiny new employment agreement. Everyone's going to sign it. Hopefully they will, but the reality is a 25-year employee can say, no, I don't like I don't like your bargain. It's got a termination clause in it. It's got other things. It's got benefits and other things. I like that. I'll take that. You don't need to put it in writing. I ain't signing that, and they don't have to. There's a legal concept, it's called consideration. So some employers will say, we're implementing a bonus program. So, in conjunction with the bonus program, we'd ask that you sign the employment agreement, and then there's some consideration or some value, there's some bargain for the exchange. Even with that said, if that's a 25-year employee and the relationship goes wrong and you decide to terminate and say, we've got this smart guy employment agreement, the pretty reasonable employee, lawyer, or counselor could have that turned over. The point of it is, if you're not doing it, start doing it. And to your point, you can at least initiate that process with your new people, if no one else. Yes?
How do you recognize, so it's an employment agreement,
Yep.
you date it for the date that you do it,
Mm-hmm.
do you recognize the 25 years they've been there?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and you can't put things in the employment agreement like, and then you weren't suggesting this, but your previous 25 years are not recognized and we start our relationship from today. Whew, I don't have to worry about that anymore as an employer. You can't contract out of what you're already obliged to do. And people sometimes think, well, the employment agreement is just taking things away from the employee. Very often, they're implemented at a time when there's a bonus program and going in, or a benefit program, or some kind of enhancement to another term and condition of employment. It doesn't have to be a one-sided street. The idea is just communicating and putting that in front of. Now, when you hire a new employee, that's a much easier thing to do because they're just coming in and that's the bargain, right? And they're more likely to agree and sign to that, because if they don't, it's like, well, I'm sorry, everyone else that works here has signed this employment agreement. If you don't choose to do so, you don't have to accept employment.
I have a question for you about consent around reference check and academic qualification
Great
check.
question.
I'm assuming you need permission to go beyond the 2 or 3 references that they provide.
Mm-hmm.
At what point and in what form do you recommend that take?
Great question. So for most of our employers, you're communicating with the employee, and I say, April, we're thinking about hiring you. Could you send me 3 references? And April sends me an email saying, here's our 3 references. Go ahead, please contact them. Like most people would say, that's consent. April has consented for me to go and contact these people. She wants the job, and I want to talk to them. You can go onto Google. We certainly have precedents. There's a million sort of, April, please, thanks for doing that. Please sign this formal agreement that you agree that I can contact your references. So same thing for education verification. We recommend that. Does everyone do that? Not usually, because April sent me an email. I got it right there that she said I was, it wasn't your question, but you can get into the sensitive area of the employer picks up the phone and goes, and if you're talking to an HR department, because I've worked in one, they're oftentimes going to say it's our company policy to confirm the position, the start date, the end date. We're not communicating anything else. Not really fair to a great employee, actually. To a poorer employee, probably the result they wouldn't mind. And what we find, if it's a really good employee, even if that's the policy, don't call the HR person. If you call their supervisor, they generally want to be helpful because that person did a good job for them. And they'll say, yeah, you will get the information. And if you're calling, we find most business owners and smaller businesses, if it was a good person, they're very willing, even if that person left them and they didn't want them to, they're very willing to be supportive and helpful. But you will get, that wasn't your question, I know, but you will get that stonewall.
Well, I'm thinking things, for example, like certificate licenses. So I run a trade-based business. So
Yep.
you can go online for the compulsory trades and search the qualifications and check. Now, I would assume that because it's public domain, anybody can check it.
That's what they're there for.
Where does that line sit between requiring consent and not? So the difference being, that's public, but if I need to verify a degree at Queen's University or somewhere else, then I would assume that you need that additional layer of consent because that's not public domain.
You're going to need it, and Queen's University probably isn't going to provide that to you without it. Right? They may have done in the past. I remember back in the day, you could call the registrar's office and you get that info. You're going to need some kind of, and it's probably online now.
Just the basic consent is good enough?
Yep. Good question, though. Okay. So, kind of skipped ahead, talking about employment agreements and contracts. I'm going to suggest legally you don't need them. If you don't have them, two things are going to apply. The Employment Standards Act, which is the bare minimum. And then if you're not unionized, Jim, I think you have union employees, so your collective agreement speaks to that half and half, so you're dealing, you have fun in both worlds, lucky you. Common law. And common law is basically what the courts think is fair in a particular set of circumstances. And the courts always think, rightly so, that what's more fair for the employee is the right result, as it should be in most cases, right? So if you don't put it in writing and you don't agree to that up front or somewhere along the way, you're going to be more or less subject to what the court thinks about something if things go wrong. And I'm not a cynical person, I'm really not, but we're talking about when things go right and you have all this in place, dandy. But we're just talking about compliance issues. Do any of you use subcontractors? I'm seeing some nods of head. We're seeing this more and more. So let's talk about subcontractors. You should have written agreements for those as well. And I'm talking about subcontractors, like I think I have 90 clients. So I'm not a subcontractor, I'm a service provider. But if you're hiring a carpenter and he or she is pretty much just working for you and maybe one other person, you probably want to put this in writing. And the reason I say that, court case just came out actually at the beginning of this year. He was in Canac Kitchens. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Canac, but I'm not sure if they're still in business in fact, but they made nice kitchens. This gentleman was a supervisor and did kitchen installs in homeowners and businesses. Canac would manufacture the kitchen cabinets, he would install them. In 1987, he said, the company said, well, you're out in people's homes and everything else. You could write off a lot of expenses as an independent contractor versus being an employee, probably better for you. So they made him an independent contractor. The company suggested it. But he still wore their shirts, their logos as he had done before. During the last 2 years of his employment with Canac, he started to do work with a bunch of other companies too. So he wasn't just doing work for them, he was doing some work for some others. In 2009, Canac, I think, it had been bought by a US company. They looked at this business and said, this is no longer a business, we're shutting it down, all the employees are terminated. So they terminated this gentleman and they said, but yeah, you're an independent contractor, you're not an employee, so we don't owe you anything. No written agreement. What do you think happened? Yeah, it's a fairly predictable result, I think. Hopefully this wasn't a brain teaser for too many of us. The court said, nonsense. This was set up for the company's benefit, not this gentleman. The work he did was minor, and he only did it during the last 2 years for others. And you were almost all of his income. So they awarded this gentleman over 2 years of pay, which is a fairly substantial figure, and $24,000 in legal costs. Yes?
Do you know if the CRA nailed them for CPP and EI?
Oh, beautiful point, because as interested in the courts and employment standards are in this, the CRA gets in line. And just because one is copacetic from CRA's point of view, employment standards may not like it, and vice versa. So I don't know the answer to your question, but I'm guessing the CRA didn't go to the employee for that money. They went right to the employer. And I would assume now this employer is bankrupt and a lot of other complicated things, but behind the scenes, but right. So if you are employing independent contractors, just like employees, we recommend you evaluate that relationship and look at putting it in writing. Makes sense. Some takeaways from that case that you might want to consider to determine whether an employee, because we have clients in the construction industry and it can get quite blurry. They'll say, Matthew, I don't really know if this guy's an employer or a subcontractor. So we look at control, ownership, staffing, and risk factors. I'm going to go over these real brief because this doesn't apply to everyone, I know. So, control. Do you tell them what to do and how to do it? Do you have priority over their time? Do they receive training and direction from you or your managers or employees? If they do, they're probably more of an employee than an independent contractor. What about tools, equipment, resources, whether that's shovels in the ground or a laptop or a cell phone? Or do they get that on their own, you reimburse them? If you do things like that, they're probably more likely to be an employee. Staffing decisions, do they have to present? Or could they say, well, no, I'm doing the work for you, but Matthew's going to do that tomorrow. I got other things to do. I might golf. Okay? So, and the final factor is risk. Are you their only source of income? Or is it maybe just you and another company? The more companies or other entities the person does work for and with, the less likely they will be determined to be an employee. This gets to be a narrower and narrower window all the time. And if employment standards doesn't get you, CRA's a little more effective. They probably will. Yes, you had a question.
With reference to the construction industry, sometimes a job can take 6 months or a year. So yes, you are a sub to that guy only that guy for 1 year.
Mm-hmm.
But you're still independent.
Mm-hmm.
You can't work
Right.
10 jobs.
You're so dedicated to that one. Maybe it's a subdivision with 30 homes in it. I don't know. Yeah, and that happens all the time. I think that would be a unique situation where once that project's done and they go to work for Mason Homes next and they may be tied up for 6 months. So it's not as much, it may not even be the time boundedness of it. In other words, it could just be, over a 5-year, maybe because home building is a very long process. Whereas building a deck on the back of someone's house is not. Installing kitchen cabinets is a week process, So I think that on that factor, you have focus less on the time and actually the project scope and the reality this person's working on different projects. This comes up in the trades, and to your point, it could be quite, that's a roofing subcontractor, and a home builder just uses them over and over and over again, and they're almost tied to them, but they've got workers and other things. Well then, it's not just, but in that case, that contractor could still decide, well, I'm sending 5 different roofing guys over tomorrow. You don't care. I'm putting on a roof. I don't have to be there. I own it. I manage it. So you've got to look at all the factors in the context. Very fact specific, but good question. There was another question.
I have kind of a weird situation too. I work in an office where we do a lot of clinical research. Mm-hmm. And as part of that, we have 2 pharmacists on staff.
Right.
And one of them is retired and only works for us.
Okay.
The other one works for multiple other pharmacies.
Right.
They sort of job share. It's mainly in the mornings.
Mm-hmm.
We've been treating them as contract employees. They're professionals and then we're a college.
Right.
Where do you think they might fall?
Well,
It's kind of fuzzy. We have to provide all of the equipment because the study protocols are very strictly
Right.
prescribed.
Right,
But they work out their hours between them.
yes.
What do you think?
Well, I certainly think the one fellow who's working in a number of different places, that kind of answers that question. The other thing I heard you say is they're kind of deciding amongst themselves how to organize the work and do it even right down to the schedule, so you don't have strict control over that. You do own, it doesn't mean you're going to fail for any one of these factors or succeed because of two of them. So, and the one gentleman being retired, is that his source of income, but maybe he's only working part-time, like it's not the case that. So for that reason, all the more reason to put it in writing, to confirm the relationship and have a mutual understanding that that's the way it's structured, rather than it just kind of being, a verbal understanding or whatnot. I think the semi-retired, you do have semi-retired folks that do this type of work, and it's only for one person, but it's because they're not really, well, they are doing it for the income, clearly, but they're not full-time kind of people or enterprises. Yes, Elizabeth?
In terms of protecting brand standards, so you have subcontractors that are doing work on your behalf, and it is a clear, I know it's a clear subcontractor
Right.
relationship, but when you overlay brand standards, it starts to present, it starts to present a little bit of fuzziness in some of these areas like control. So in the subcontractor agreement, can you have an element in there about brand standard and expectation?
Oh yes, and I mean, I think beyond that, from a business operations point of view, just trying to see what that would fit.
Well, with control, it's sort of methods, because
Yeah.
you might be using your brand
Yeah.
materials. There's it's
Well-
the control one that I'm kind of seeing some overlap with brand.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point, and I think in a lot of these cases, you're employing a subcontractor, but for legitimate business reasons, for the purpose of the customer, it's your business. Like, they don't necessarily need to know or they don't understand the commercial relationship behind it. So I think it's, again, you've got this one factor where you're controlling a lot of that, but your relationship as an independent one isn't necessarily going to be undermined or eliminated just because you kind of fail, if you will, the answers to some of these questions. If they have other clients, they're doing other work, they're determining, within the context of your quality protocols or brand norms or whatever the case may be, you're dictating that, and you have the right to dictate that in your business. I think that's fine, but and that's why I say the correct answers to any one of these factors won't necessarily protect the relationship or justify it. It won't necessarily have it fail either. You've got to look at the whole context. And the CRA and employment standards look at the whole context. And the other thing to keep in mind is just because you and the employee have agreed it will work that way doesn't necessarily make it so. Okay? And some of the times we have had experiences with employers where it wasn't the employer that suggested this, the employee did. And they said, well, I'm working part-time, and I had a physician's office, person who worked there for 20 years and had requested this originally. Of course, it wasn't put in writing. It was a fairly informal relationship. At the end of the 20 years, he's retiring. He's retiring, winding down his practice. He says, thanks for your services. And he gets a letter requesting back pay for vacation pay and overtime. And he was kind of like, well, you were an independent, you requested it that way, and you gave me, it almost looked like a waiter or waitress's order slip with her hours on it, and she submitted it and he would pay it. And he had this demand through employment standards for vacation pay and overtime. So it's not always the employer that's asking for these relationships. Sometimes the employees are, because there's advantageous tax deduction and other things of being an independent person. So just because the employee agrees doesn't make it so. Good questions. Very fact-specific questions, though, too. And I'm giving you some really loose guidelines to help you qualify or determine whether your relationship can be supported under one way of thinking or the other. But great questions. Okay. Policies. Do any of you have human resources or HR policies in your organizations? I'm seeing hands. Yes? Okay. Sort of. Okay, well, you probably either do or you do not. Maybe you're thinking about it. Are these required? Do you have to have them, or do you just do them because you thought it was a good idea?
I think some of them we would have to have policy, employment policies, but maybe not the employee.
Yeah, no, I think April's on the right track here. Policy manuals not required. You do need policies for certain things. AODA, workplace harassment and violence prevention, and health and safety. Is everyone familiar with the AODA? It's new, but it's not new. I keep calling it new. It's not new anymore. The accessibility standard. So if a few years ago you did the AODA customer service training and everything else with your employees, and had them sign off on that, you got your customer service policy posted in your window of your business, that's great too. Just this past year, depending on your size of business, you would have also had, there's a new standard, the Integrated Accessibility Standard Regulation, IASR. So if you did the AODA stuff a few years ago and thought, yeah, it's done and dusted, great. Just Google AODA IASR. Make sure you've got that in place as well. There's some additional training, including human rights code training that you've got to get done with your folks. And you've got to update your policies. If you're over 50 employees, you also need a multi-year plan, which documents and charts your compliance with AODA to the year 2020. Then, we're told in 2020 you're done, until they figure out something else they want to do with the AODA in 2020. Okay, so you don't need a policy manual. These are if you're going to have a policy manual, we have a program, depending on the business, I think it's between 15 and 20 policies we recommend and kind of structure into your business so it reflect current practices and things you have in place already. If you want just the bare basics, these are the 8 things we recommend. As April suggested to us, these 3 are non-negotiable. You must have policies for these even if you do not have a policy manual. Health and safety. In summer of 2014, you were supposed to have done supervisor and employee training in health and safety. The government did a nice job and did that. There was a link right online. I can send it to you if you don't have it. Just have all your people go through it. You're supposed to do that in 2014. And all your new employees were supposed to have done that. Same thing with harassment and violence prevention in the workplace. Bill 168, 2012, you're supposed to have done it then. If you haven't done that, you should get on it and do it with your new employees as well. And the accessibility one I spoke to already. Okay. So speaking of workplace harassment, and I bring this up because it is an interesting topic. We're doing, it seems, 1 or 2 harassment investigations in workplaces every month. We never saw that before, but there's all sorts of new legislation coming up on this. There's all sorts of high-profile cases. There was that Hydro One employee, I think you probably all saw it. Was that in the summer? He said some very disparaging things to a female reporter. He was fired. He was a union employee, so he got reinstated. He's back to work. We knew that would happen. Jian Ghomeshi, kind of a high-profile case that reminded us we've got to have workplace harassment and violence policies and training in our workplaces. He's not out of the woods yet. I think there's still some additional trials maybe this summer. So that's been kind of a spectacular situation. And there's the Human Rights Code. I've mentioned all this. There's new sexual harassment legislation pending. And I was very interested in this for a lot of reasons. Among them, there's all sorts of stuff already. I'm not sure why they need to specifically implement that, because it's not like it's legal to sexually harass in the workplace. Never has been, but it's specific, so they're doing that. And the Occupational Health and Safety Act, I was in a panel. There was some health and safety people there as well. I was in a panel and doing a session like this for a trade group. And I suggested to them that, that's going to become probably right to refuse unsafe work. And they said they'll never do that. It's nonsense. Well, it turns out they are going to amend the Health and Safety Act to allow people to refuse work on that basis as well. So that'll be a new right, probably in conjunction with this one here. Really interesting. Recent harassment case. This was in a unionized workplace. So Jim, you might, in unionized workplaces, if any of you have worked in there, or have that in your workplace, it's quite difficult to terminate employees or even take corrective action because of the very substantial protections that unions provide to workers. In this case, there was a disagreement between two employees. They were working on shift, disagreement. They leave work. One of them goes home and posts derogatory comments about the other employee on Facebook. They didn't say it was Facebook, I don't think, in the case, but it sounded like Facebook. And a lot of the complaints we have start with Facebook or emails. It's quite interesting. I guess I do have a Facebook account, but someone else manages it for me. But I understand there's public settings and private settings. This person had everything public that everyone could see. Other coworkers that evening saw the derogatory comments and they decided, hey, I'm going to join the party. Maybe people were having a glass of wine. I don't know. It got out of control. It got a little bit out of control. The person who was subject to these derogatory requirements came to work the next day, went to the HR person and said, this is crazy. Look at all this. And it happened outside of work. The employer took action, investigated, rightly so, took action, terminated the employee, unionized employee. What do you think? Was that workplace harassment? Happened outside of work. It was a one-time situation. Okay? Unionized workplace. Harassment? What do you think? Who doesn't think it's harassment? Not. Okay. And that Hydro worker got his job back. Do you think this character got their job back? Unionized. Well, I'm still wondering about that Hydro worker, actually. That's an odd one, because this one, the employer had a very clear harassment policy. They had done training with everyone. They terminated this person.
That was actually my question. You said, is it or isn't it? It kind of depends on what you put in place before an incident happens.
It does.
Sure, had they skipped the training and the policy, it would have been a much more difficult case to make.
I think you're probably right about that.
So I think part of what was missing on the, the parameters of the case was the background, because it's much more clear once we know that the training had been done.
No,
we were talking about risk mitigation.
Yep.
This is obviously something you cannot go back and do. There's no do-overs.
There's no do-overs.
Or not.
That's right. It either is or it isn't.
Yeah.
Wouldn't they even say, like, these days people are constantly talking about harassment, and even with schools and stuff, even if you leave the school ground and go home and start posting things publicly on a source like that, you would be considered harassing a person. So regardless if it's at work or not, it's still considered part of the ecosystem of your life.
Yep.
So you're still bringing other people into the business that's not really theirs. So it would still be,
I agree with you. I think the observation is times have changed. Bill 168, 2012, things changed. We had unionized workplaces where people punched other people in the face. We had a situation with a client where one gentleman held another gentleman's head in an open press in a factory, was terminated and was reinstated. Something's changed. The courts will reinstate if an employee is insubordinate in a workplace, a unionized workplace in particular. The courts, they kind of favor the employees. It's okay. I mean, the companies are big. Where it comes to harassment and violence, something's changed in society. Something has changed in the courts very dramatically. They've said enough. Enough is enough. There's many other cases. Unionized hospital employees, 37 years of service, terminated, upheld. We never have seen that before, ever. And I think it's the right thing. And I think the very clear message, at least in Ontario, but elsewhere too, is that this kind of stuff will not be tolerated, harassment of any kind, violence certainly, in any workplaces anymore. I can't tell you what happened with that Hydro One employee. I'm very surprised about that. And trust me, Hydro One's not done with him. And they have the resources to test that, and it will be tested further. So something has changed. And for the good, for the better, I think. Okay.
Sorry.
Yes.
Do you know if there was any compensation awarded to the employee that was terminated, or was he just terminated, no pay, or do you know?
Oh, I think he or she, you can Google that. Yeah, Google that. He was terminated for cause, so no pay.
Going to arbitration,
Yeah, no, like I said, this employer had the right programs in place, the right environment. They acted on the information, and they were successful. To your point, Jennifer, Yeah, I wonder if they didn't have all that in place, the law's still the law, would it have been as clear? Hard to know what would have happened. These are, an arbitrations court, everything's so fact specific. I've given you really a 30,000 aerial foot view. There was a lot of detail in there. Every case is different. You can't judge one by another, but I think by having this in place, if this happens in your workplace, you have a better chance of resolving it. Rather than, like I said, we've done 2 harassment investigations in the last 4 weeks, and there's no policies in place, there's no documentation, so we kind of have to investigate, give our report to the legal counsel, and they'll make the final decision on it. But it's a little bit easier when this is in place and the employer has acted and put in writing, taking corrective action in similar instances or that. It's just a lot easier for us to do our job in a fair and balanced way.
Can you add your own policies to a harassment, like you kind of base it off of the government's harassment policy, but can you put in something like, using social media to slander fellow employees also considered?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, April. I think, you're probably walking into a world that you're probably going to walk into anyway, so why not address it in a policy? We have suggested language around that, social media, blogs, other things, because a lot of businesses, like Paul's job, he's always putting stuff on social, am I right in thinking that, Paul, on social media and stuff like that? So let's say, Paul posts something on social media, maybe with his employer account, maybe not, and this would never happen, Elizabeth can verify, stumbling out of a nightclub and falling on George Street and, it has nothing to do, it was not on chamber business, let's hope. Better check those expense accounts. I'll talk to Stu before I leave. But he has a sort of social media and public persona which reflects on his image in the workplace and in our business community, I think. It's fair to say. So can the employer take action on something like that? What does your policy say? It's complicated. It's not black and white. It's fact specific. It's where our work and our world gets very interesting. But to your point, April, all these things we never had the social media stuff. It's all colluding together. Invariably, when we have an employee conflict, there is a Twitter feed, an email, there's some kind of electronic dimension to it that there never used to be. Interesting. Okay, keep going here. My clicker's run out of click. Oh, no it hasn't. So, yeah, like we said, have a well-articulated policy, train employees, and have a mechanism to deal with incidents. All right. So just coming to the final cornerstone here, and you know what? I'll go over this really quickly because I know you're on your lunch hour, and this might be one where next year we could even do a deeper dive module on this, because everything I've talked about has been boogeyman stuff, right? This is actually good stuff, doing performance appraisals, setting goals, providing feedback to your staff. How do you develop and engage performance in the workplace to drive performance organizationally? What is motivation? What is motivation? It's a lunch hour, it's a sunny day. It's a set of forces, my simple definition, cause people to behave in certain ways. If you're a manager, your goal is to maximize desired behavior and minimize outcomes which are not desirable in the workplace, very simply put. How are you going to do that? Well, there's a lot of different determinants of individual performance. Basically, we talked about hiring and getting the right person. You hire them with some ability. They can enhance their ability over time, but it takes a long period of time generally. The work environment, if you have unlimited resources in your work environment, great, you can drive performance right out the window, but most of us don't have unlimited resources. Motivation is the key driver, and motivation can be leveraged very powerfully to affect performance both of the individual and the organization if you've got a robust system in place for developing motivation and engaging people. One of the things we suggest that can do that are performance evaluations, performance reviews. Do any of you do performance evaluations or performance reviews in your workplace? Right. Okay. So we do a lot of training and workshop work with employers on this to enhance and develop supervisory ability, skill, and comfort level, quite frankly, with doing this with employees, invariably, do you like doing performance reviews, by the way? You do. Jennifer likes to do them. Good.
I don't have like every 6 months big deals.
Yeah.
It's more of a
Continuous.
constant conversation. We do have more of a coaching conversation as opposed to a conflict resolution conversation because of that. And the more immediate feedback also provides sort of course correction rather than, hey, you're doing this wrong for 6 months.
I like that. And you're on the right path already, because generally when we go in to look at an existing performance evaluation process and why the employees don't like doing it and the supervisors even less, it's not a performance development process. It's a performance correction process. It's about giving constructive feedback. Productivity could improve, quality of work's pretty good, but that could improve. Your attendance kind of sloppy against the norms that we track. You had 3 work time, medical aids, your health and safety compliance has to improve. So there's kind of a corrective course, and we're trying to get improvement. We're trying to encourage improvement. And I'm not saying that performance correction isn't a valid objective in a performance management system. In fact, it is. But development is different. It's about goals, growth, and improvement. Both of these systems of communication with employees, the goal is to improve. Different ways of getting there. And all I'm saying, and Jennifer's already there with her comment, decide which side of the highway you're driving down, so to speak, before you have the conversation with the employee. Are you trying to correct behavior, or are you trying to develop potential? Because if you're trying to develop potential and you introduce stuff on this side of the highway, drive down both sides at the same time, you're going to have a collision. And it's going to undermine the impact of that. And you want that. Even with your worst employee, you want to do that, at least occasionally. Okay? So focus on high potential employees with your development systems. Grow and develop performance. Don't be distracted by the 5%, the underperformers. And even with those underperformers, give them their day for development. Park the corrective action stuff for one day and have a real meaningful development discussion with them. Like I said, we've probably covered that topic way too quick, and it's actually worth maybe another session another time. You can do a deeper dive into it. If you want to know more about performance development and all that kind of stuff, I have written a book on that. It is available on Kindle and Amazon. It's about $9, but if you want a free copy, you can email me and I'll send you a copy. You can download it or upload it to your e-reader, or if you don't have an e-reader, you can have a PDF. So that last topic I really skated over quick, but you know what? It's probably the most impactful and exciting thing you can do in your workplace from a developmental point of view. And so if you're looking or thinking about implementing a performance development system, you're on the right path. Assuming and thinking that you've got all those foundational pieces that we overviewed in place already. Covered an awful lot, an awful short period of time, but I appreciate your comments and your attentiveness, especially over lunch hour, and I'm happy to take any questions and stick around for a few minutes. I know some of you have to get back to work, no doubt, about anything that I talked about or other things for that matter. So thank you.
Any questions for Matthew? You answered quite a few
Sure.
through the session, which is great.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
One here, our performance evaluation does exactly what you just talked about. We deal with both things at once.
Okay.
And it's kind of interesting that you bring that up, and it's just right after you just said, okay, you're screwing up here, here, and what would you like to do when you go forward? So you can see where that goes sideways. But reading more and more about exactly the topic of your book is that people are kind of eschewing the traditional performance evaluation. Most people that hate them are saying, good, we don't have to do it anymore.
Yes.
Obviously it has to be replaced with something. So what do we,
Well,
the communication
yeah.
goes on and on that Jennifer talked about?
Jennifer talked about, more, and we didn't get into it here, but more converting that to a continuous process. I do recommend, though, that you start with kind of a more orthodox and it could be once a year, twice a year, but that it's focused on goals and developing potential, as opposed, because the problem is, if you talk about that and you just have one conversation around this piece, it's human nature for some reason that person walks out of the room focused on this piece and forgetting all the good stuff you talked about. So don't don't undermine that opportunity by introducing this. This you should do in real time when it happens. You shouldn't save it up for the end of the year for a performance appraisal discussion.
Should not be any surprises.
Should not be any surprises. You're absolutely right. Yeah. It's a very good point.
Any
Okay.
other questions?